Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Go ahead and dim the lights, find your favorite blanket, and just settle in. Tonight, we're going to step away from the marble palaces and the genetically questionable royals for a bit. Instead, we're heading into the high country. We're going to talk about the mountain men, those rugged, often slightly unhinged individuals of the 19th century American West who decided that society was too much and that living in a frozen gulch was a personality trait. Specifically, we're looking at what they understood about the cold. Because let's be honest, we've forgotten how to be cold. We have smart thermostats and moisture-wicking synthetic fibers, yet we still complain when the walk from the car to the grocery store takes more than 30 seconds. The mountain men didn't have that luxury. They lived in a world where layering meant putting on another greasy deer hide and hoping the lice didn't mind the extra company. So let's float back to the 1820s and see how these men survived the kind of temperatures that would make a modern puffy jacket give up and quit. The first thing you have to understand about the mountain man, men like Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, or the perpetually unlucky Hugh Glass, is that they didn't fight the cold. Fighting the cold is an exhausting, losing game. If you fight the cold eventually wins, usually by taking a few of your toes as a trophy. No, these guys entered into a sort of begrudging, miserable partnership with the winter. They understood that the greatest enemy in a sub-zero mountain pass isn't actually the frost, it's moisture. Your own sweat is effectively a biological betrayal. You're hiking up a ridge in the Rockies, you're working hard, you start to glow a little bit, and suddenly your own body has turned your clothes into a damp, freezing tomb. The mountain men knew this. They moved with a specific, slow, plodding economy of motion. It wasn't laziness, it was tactical survival. If you saw a trapper moving fast, he was either being chased by a grizzly or he had deeply miscalculated his life choices that morning. They wore buckskin, which, contrary to the Hollywood version, where it looks like soft, brushed suede, was often stiff, blackened by campfire smoke, and smelled like a combination of old wet dog and wood soot. But it worked. When it got wet, it froze into a literal suit of armor. There are accounts of men having to thaw themselves out by a fire just so they could sit down. Imagine coming home from work and needing a blowtorch just to bend your knees. That was a Tuesday for them. Because why not add inability to sit to your list of daily struggles? And then there was the grease. We have specialized lotions and barrier creams now. They had bear fat. If you wanted to stay warm, you didn't just wear the animal, you smeared the animal on your skin. It served as a windbreaker, a moisturizer, and a way to ensure that no one, human or otherwise, wanted to stand downwind of you. It was a very effective social distancing tool, a century before it was trendy. Let's consider the buffalo robe. This wasn't just a blanket, it was a mobile habitat. A single buffalo hide is incredibly heavy, but it's also nature's most efficient insulator. A trapper would wrap himself in one of these, fur side in, and essentially create a microclimate powered entirely by his own unwashed body heat. It was cozy, trapped in a heavy rug with a distinct musk kind of way. They understood that the earth is a giant heat sink. They didn't sleep on the ground, they slept with it. They'd dig a shallow trench, burn a small fire in it until the soil was warm, kick the coals out, lay down their robe, and slide in. It was like a prehistoric heated mattress pad, provided you didn't mind the occasional stray ember melting your leggings. They also had a very different relationship with food than we do. We think of calories as something to be managed or avoided. To a mountain man in the dead of a Teton winter, calories were literal logs for the internal furnace. They didn't want a balanced salad. They wanted marrow bones and dipui, the highly prized fat from along the backbone of a buffalo. They would eat pounds of pure fat in a sitting. It sounds unappealing to us, but when it's minus 40 degrees and you're living in a lean-to made of pine branches, a bowl of hot fat is basically a religious experience. It kept the internal fire burning. Without it, you were just a very cold, very grumpy statue.
There was also a certain mental surrender required. We spend so much energy trying to maintain a perfect 72 degrees at all times. The mountain men just accepted that for 4 months of the year, they were going to be varying degrees of miserable. There's a strange kind of warmth in that acceptance, a quiet, stoic endurance. They knew that the cold wasn't an intruder, it was the landlord, and the rent was paid in shivering, tallow-heavy meals and the occasional lost fingernail. Of course, they weren't all silent philosophers. Most of them were just tired, hungry, and wondering why they hadn't stayed in St. Louis to work in a dry goods store. But they stayed. They stayed because the mountains offered a silence that even the biting wind couldn't break. They learned the language of the ice. They knew which wood popped too much in a fire and which would burn low and blue all night long. They knew that a dog's breath on your feet was better than any wool sock yet invented. It was a life of ironic contrasts. They were the masters of the wilderness, yet they were entirely at the mercy of a sudden shift in the wind. They were fiercely independent, yet they would have died in a week without the survival techniques they learned from the indigenous peoples who had been thriving in the cold for millennia. They were tough, sure, but they were mostly just very, very patient.
The rituals of the rhyme and the fever of the fur trade. All right. Let's keep that cozy, sleepy vibe going. So we've dipped our toes into the general misery and grim acceptance of the mountain man's winter. Now let's drill down into the specific, often bizarre rituals they developed to survive the kind of cold that would make your eyelashes freeze together. And then we'll drift into the strange psychological toll that months of isolation and constant chill took on these rather unique individuals. The first, and perhaps most critical ritual, was the daily maintenance of fire. This wasn't just a casual thing like flicking on your gas fireplace. This was life and death. Carrying fire was a skill in itself. Often they'd use punk wood, partially rotted wood that smolders for hours, or a piece of dried fungus tucked into a horn or a metal tin. Imagine trying to keep a tiny glowing ember alive while riding a horse through a blizzard. It was a full-time job. Losing your fire meant a night of absolute shivering terror and potentially the end of your story. So the fire wasn't just heat, it was hope. It was a tiny flickering defiance against the overwhelming indifferent white. They became connoisseurs of wood. Not all wood burns equal, especially when it's been damp for 3 months. They learned which trees would offer a quick, bright blaze for cooking, and which would provide a slow, steady heat through the night, leaving a bed of coals that could be revived in the morning. Cottonwood, often plentiful along river bottoms, was decent, but it burned fast. Pine would spit and pop, throwing sparks that could ignite a robe or a lean-to, a terrifying prospect in the middle of nowhere. Aspen was a reliable choice, but the real prize was old, dry, deadfall timber, especially hardwood if they could find it. It was heavy, but it paid dividends in consistent warmth. They knew the language of the forest, not in a poetic sense, but in a very practical, will this keep my fingers from falling off sense. Then there was the shelter. A simple lean-to, often just a few poles covered with hides or pine boughs, was the standard, but it was how they augmented it that mattered. Snow, the very thing that made life so difficult, was also their friend. They'd pack snow around the base of their lean-to, creating an insulating wall. Sometimes, if they were in a really exposed area and planning to stay a while, they might dig a more substantial snow cave or partially excavated dugout into a hillside. These weren't igloos, mind you. They were more like slightly damp, very cold hobbit holes, but they offered a degree of protection from the wind that a simple lean-to couldn't. It's ironic, isn't it? Using the cold itself to fight the cold, because why not lean into the paradox? Clothing was another area where necessity bred invention. While buckskin was common, especially for outer layers, they also relied heavily on wool when they could get it. Wool, even when wet, retains a good deal of its insulating properties. A pair of thick wool socks, even if they hadn't been washed since the last rendezvous, was worth its weight in beaver kelts.
And then there were the blankets. Multiple layers of wool blankets, often augmented with buffalo robes, were essential for sleeping. They understood that it wasn't just about one thick layer, but about creating multiple air pockets, each trapping body heat. This was basic thermodynamics applied by men who probably couldn't spell thermodynamics. Footwear was a constant battle. Frozen feet were a leading cause of misery and amputation. Moccasins were common, but in deep snow they were useless without overshoes or wraps. They'd often make crude snowshoes from bent willow branches and rawhide, allowing them to travel over deep drifts without sinking. But even with snowshoes, the feet remained vulnerable. They'd pack their moccasins with dry grass or fur, constantly changing it out as it became damp from sweat. The mantra was, if your feet are warm, the rest of you has a fighting chance. If your feet are cold, you're just a shivering mess waiting for trouble. Let's float over to the internal landscape now. The long winters were not just physically brutal, they were mentally grinding. Imagine months, sometimes entirely alone, with nothing but the vast, silent, white expanse for company. No Netflix, no TikTok, not even a grumpy coworker to complain to. Just you, your thoughts, and the constant nagging cold. This led to what some historians have called mountain fever or cabin fever, a kind of creeping madness brought on by isolation and sensory deprivation. Accounts from the period describe trappers becoming erratic, talking to themselves, seeing things that weren't there, or developing intense, often irrational fixations. One trapper might spend weeks meticulously carving a tiny wooden figure, only to smash it to pieces in a fit of pique. Another might stare at a single snowflake until he felt he understood the secrets of the universe. The silence was so profound that their own thoughts would become amplified, echoing in the vast emptiness. It's like being stuck in an elevator for months, except the elevator is made of ice, and the only other occupant is your own increasingly strange internal monologue. The communal aspect of the rendezvous, held once a year, wasn't just about trading furs. It was a psychological pressure release valve. It was a chance to see another human face, to hear a different voice, to have a conversation that didn't involve arguing with a particularly stubborn squirrel. Men would travel hundreds of miles, often enduring incredible hardship, just for the fleeting company of others. It was a desperate hunger for social interaction, a stark reminder that even the most rugged individualists aren't meant to be completely alone for such extended periods. They craved the stories, the tall tales, the bad whiskey, and even the occasional brawl, anything to break the monotonous drone of winter solitude. Even their relationships with animals took on a different quality. Their horses, essential for transportation, became companions in a way we rarely understand today. They weren't just tools, they were fellow sufferers. And the wild animals, the deer, the elk, the buffalo, were both food and, in a strange way, neighbors. They understood the movements of these animals with an intimacy that seems almost mystical to us now. It was a predatory relationship, yes, but also one of deep respect and understanding, born of shared struggle against the same harsh environment. So when we think of the mountain man, it's not just about the coonskin cap and the long rifle. It's about a profound understanding of energy, how to conserve it, how to generate it, and how to protect it from the constant drain of the cold. It's about a stoic resilience, not just against the physical discomfort, but against the insidious mental erosion of isolation. They didn't conquer the cold. They learned to live within its icy embrace, finding a strange, grim rhythm in the heart of winter.
The frozen palate and the ghosts of the high pass. So we've talked about the fires and the creeping silence of the mountain fever. Now, go ahead and take a deep breath. Adjust your pillow. We're going to drift into the sensory world of the mountain man, specifically what they ate to keep the engine running and how they treated their broken bodies when there wasn't a doctor for 500 miles. It's a world of grease, grit, and some truly questionable medical choices that, remarkably, worked.
When you're burning 5 or 6,000 calories a day just to keep your blood from turning into slush, your relationship with food becomes intense. For a mountain man, a meal wasn't a social event, it was a refueling stop. And their superfood wasn't kale or quinoa, it was fat. Pure, unadulterated animal fat. They had this term marrow bones, which sounds like something you'd find at a trendy gas pub today for $40, but for them, it was the ultimate prize. They would crack open the femur of a freshly killed buffalo or elk and scoop out the warm, buttery marrow. It was pure energy, a shot of concentrated life force that hit the bloodstream like lightning. To them, the lean meat, what we consider the good stuff, like sirloin, was almost an afterthought. In fact, if they only ate lean meat, they'd suffer from rabbit starvation, a real and terrifying condition where the body wastes away despite a full stomach because it lacks fat to process the protein. Imagine, for a moment, sitting by a low fire in the Wind River Range. The wind is howling outside your lean-to, a sound like 1,000 ghosts trying to get in. You're roasting a piece of depuis, that fat from the buffalo's back. It's sizzling, dripping into the coals with a heavy, rich scent that cuts through the smell of wet buckskin. You eat it with your knife, the grease coating your beard, your hands, your soul. It's not elegant, it's visceral. But as that fat hits your stomach, a glow starts to spread. It's the only true warmth in a world of blue ice. Then there was pemmican. This was the original survival bar, a technology borrowed from the native tribes. It was a mixture of dried, pounded meat, melted fat, and sometimes dried berries if they were feeling fancy. It was dense, it was hard as a rock, and it would last for years. You could carry a pouch of it and survive for weeks. It tasted, by most accounts, like a greasy candle mixed with sawdust, but when you're trekking through a waist-deep drift in the bitterroots, a handful of pemmican was the difference between making it to the next valley or becoming a permanent part of the landscape. Of course, the diet wasn't always buffalo and berries. Sometimes it was starvation poles. If the game moved out or the snow was too deep to hunt, these men ate whatever didn't eat them first. There are records of trappers eating their own moccasins, boiling the rawhide for hours until it reached a consistency somewhere between a rubber band and a nightmare. They'd eat their horses, which was a heartbreaking choice, like eating your car and your best friend at the same time. They'd eat dogs, wolves, and in the direst of straits, they looked at each other with a very specific kind of nervousness, because why not keep the options open when the temperature hits 40 below? But let's talk about their medicine, because when you're living a life of extreme outdoor sports without a helmet, things break. They got frostbite, they got mountain fever, which was likely a tick-borne illness, and they got mauled by things with very large teeth. Their pharmacy was the forest. For a cough, they'd boil pine needles for vitamin C, long before they knew what a vitamin was. For a wound, they'd use piss and vinegar, or more accurately, they'd cauterize it with a hot knife or pack it with beaver musk. Beaver musk, or castoreum, was the Swiss Army knife of the mountains. It's a yellowish secretion from the beaver's scent glands. It smells pungent, like a leather factory exploded in a swamp. But the mountain men used it for everything. They used it as a lure for their traps, sure, but they also used it as a medicine. It contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. So if a trapper had a splitting headache or a fever, he'd take a bit of beaver musk. It probably tasted like a wet dog's gym bag, but it actually worked. It's a weirdly poetic image, a rugged, bearded man in the middle of a frozen wilderness eating beaver secretions to cure a headache caused by the sheer silence of the mountains. And we can't talk about Mountain Man in the cold without mentioning the legendary Hugh Glass. You've probably seen the movie where he gets mauled by a bear, but the real story is much more sleepless historian material. After being left for dead because his companions figured, hey, he's basically a meatloaf at this point, Glass woke up. He had a broken leg, his ribs were exposed, and he was alone. He didn't have a med kit. He had his own sheer, stubborn refusal to die. He crawled for 6 weeks. To prevent gangrene from setting into the rotting wounds on his back, he laid himself over a rotting log and let maggots eat the dead flesh. It's disgusting, yes, but it was brilliant. The maggots only eat the necrotic tissue, leaving the healthy stuff behind. It's a natural, squirmy surgical strike. He survived on wild berries and the occasional leftover from a wolf kill. He didn't survive because he was tough in the way we think of it. He survived because he understood the biology of the wilderness better than he understood people. There's a quiet lesson in that. The mountain men understood that the human body is surprisingly resilient if you stop pampering it. They lived in a constant state of hormetic stress, small doses of hardship that made the whole system stronger. They didn't have wellness retreats. Their entire life was a wellness retreat, if your idea of wellness involves sleeping in a snowbank and eating bear grease. As the winter dragged on, the physical and the spiritual began to blur. They'd spend hours watching the way the wind carved the snow into sastrugi, those sharp wave-like ridges. They knew that the shape of the snow told the story of the wind from 3 days ago. They became trackers of time as much as animals. They lived in a slow-motion world. When you're that cold for that long, your heart rate actually slows down. Your thoughts become rhythmic. You start to move in time with the swaying of the pines. It was a lonely life, but was it a lonely heart? Many of these men found a strange peace in the cold. In the modern world, we're constantly bombarded by noise, light, and content. For the mountain man, the only content was the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. There's a certain luxury in that kind of focus. When your only goal for the day is don't freeze and find a beaver, life becomes remarkably simple. The complexities of politics, social standing, and keeping up with the Joneses melt away when the Joneses are 300 miles away and probably also eating their shoes. So, as we settle into the final stretch of our journey tonight, just think about that internal fire. The mountain men knew that as long as that little ember was burning, whether it was fed by buffalo fat, beaver musk, or just old-fashioned spite, the cold couldn't truly touch them. They were the masters of the shiver, the kings of the frost, and the original experts in the art of doing a lot with absolutely nothing.
The Great Thaw and the Noise of Civilization. So, here we are. The fire's burning low, the shadows are stretching across the floor, and we've reached the part of the story where the ice finally begins to break. But for the mountain man, the spring thaw wasn't always a relief. In fact, for many, it was the beginning of a much more difficult season. Because while they had mastered the art of surviving the sub-zero silence of the Rockies, they were completely unprepared for the loud, crowded, and increasingly comfortable world that was creeping up behind them. By the late 1830s and early 1840s, the fashion world in London and Paris, in its infinite and fickle wisdom, decided that beaver hats were out and silk hats were in. Just like that, the entire economic engine of the Rocky Mountain fur trade stalled. The beaver, which had been the currency of the wilderness, was suddenly just a damp rodent again. And the men who had spent decades smearing themselves in bear grease and talking to trees found themselves in a bit of a professional crisis. Imagine being Jim Bridger or Kit Carson. You've survived grizzly attacks, navigated mountain passes that didn't have names until you walked over them, and you've mastered the art of sleeping in a snowdrift. And then someone tells you that your entire way of life is over because some dandy in London thinks silk looks shinier. It's the ultimate ironic twist. They were conquered not by the cold, but by a change in hat materials. This led to a strange and often melancholy transition. These men had to come down from the high country, and coming down didn't just mean a change in altitude, it meant a change in soul. They tried to reintegrate. Some became guides for the wagon trains of settlers heading to Oregon and California. These were the pioneers we see in the movies, families in covered wagons who thought a rainy afternoon was a hardship.
Imagine the internal monologue of a mountain man watching a settler complain about a dusty trail. "Sir, I once ate a pair of moccasins while hiding from a blizzard in a hollowed-out elk carcass. Please, tell me more about your uncomfortable seat cushion." They became the scouts, the bridge between the old wild world and the new fenced-in one. But they were like ghosts in their own time. They walked through the growing towns of the West, but they didn't really belong there. The air in a house felt heavy and stagnant to them. The sound of a piano or the clatter of a busy street was an assault on ears that were tuned to the snap of a dry twig or the distant whistle of an elk. They had what we might call reverse seasonal affective disorder. They missed the clarity of the cold. They missed the way the cold simplified the world into warm and not warm. There's a story about a trapper who, after retiring to a farm in Missouri, would still go out and sleep on his porch in a buffalo robe when it snowed. His family thought he was losing his mind, but he wasn't. He was just homesick for the shiver. He missed the way the cold made him feel alive. When everything is easy, when the heat is constant and the food is served on a plate, the edges of the self start to blur. The mountain men lived on the edge. Without the cold to push against, they felt like they were floating away. And then there was the physical toll. You can't live a life of hormetic stress forever without the bill coming due. The joints that had frozen and thawed 1,000 times started to ache with a permanent rheumatism. The lungs that had inhaled wood smoke and sub-zero air for 20 years grew tired. Many of them died relatively young, their bodies simply worn out by the sheer intensity of their existence. They were like high-performance engines that had been run at redline for too long. They were tough, yes, but even the hardest steel becomes brittle if you quench it in ice too many times. But what did they leave behind? What is the mountain man's legacy besides some very colorful stories and some truly questionable recipes for marrow? They left us a reminder of what the human spirit is capable of when it stops fighting nature and starts listening to it. They understood that we aren't separate from the environment, we are a part of it. When it's cold, you don't just deal with it, you become a creature of the cold. You change your gait, your diet, your thoughts. We live in a world of climate control. We've managed to turn the entire year into a lukewarm, fluorescent-lit experience. And while that's great for our survival rates, I think we've lost a little bit of that internal fire the mountain men relied on. We've forgotten that there is a certain beauty in the struggle. There is a clarity that comes when the sun sets behind a jagged peak, and you realize that your survival for the next 12 hours depends entirely on your ability to strike a spark and keep a tiny flame alive. The era of the mountain man was brief, barely 40 years, but it looms large in our collective imagination. They represent a version of ourselves that we've mostly outgrown, but still secretly admire. The part of us that wants to throw the smartphone into a river, wrap ourselves in a heavy blanket, and just exist. No notifications, no deadlines, just the slow, rhythmic breathing of the winter woods. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe think of them. Think of the silence of a high mountain pass in January. Think of the way the stars look when there's no city light for 500 miles, sharp, cold, and impossibly bright. Think of the steady, slow heartbeat of a man wrapped in a buffalo robe, tucked into the side of a hill, perfectly content with the fact that he is exactly where he is supposed to be. The cold isn't something to be feared, it's just another state of being. It's a teacher of patience, a builder of fire, and a keeper of secrets. The mountain men knew this. They understood that the greatest warmth doesn't come from a furnace or a heater, but from the quiet, stubborn flame of the human will, burning bright and steady in the deepest winter. And that, I think, is a good place to leave it. The fire has finally turned to glowing coals, and the mountains are draped in a heavy, silent blanket of white. Thank you for joining me on this long, chilly walk through the high country. I hope it's helped you settle in and perhaps given you a bit of appreciation for your own warm bed and your own steady heartbeat. Good night, everyone. The mountains will still be there in the morning, and the fire will be waiting to be rebuilt. But for now, just let the cold stay outside. You're safe, you're warm, and the story is done. Good night.
The echo of the ice and the ghostly legacy. Still awake? That's all right. Just stay tucked in. The fire is just a memory of orange embers now, and the frost is thick on the window pane. Or at least we can pretend it is. We followed our mountain men from their greasy, tallow-filled dinners to their lonely, shivering retreats in the high passes. We've seen them struggle with the mountain fever and watched as the world they built out of beaver pelts and iron will slowly melted away under the sun of the industrial age. Now, let's look at the long shadow they cast, the things they left behind that still haunt our modern understanding of the wild. You see, the mountain man didn't just vanish into the tall grass of a Missouri farm. They left a psychic imprint on the land. Even today, if you find yourself in a remote corner of the Yellowstone or deep in the Gila wilderness when the temperature drops and the wind starts that specific low-frequency moan through the pines, you can almost feel them. It's a feeling of being watched, not by something hostile, but by a standard of endurance that we can barely comprehend. They are the ghosts of the high country, the silent judges of our Gore-Tex jackets and our GPS units. There's a specific irony in how we remember them. We've turned them into icons of rugged individualism, but as we've discussed, they were actually masters of integration. They didn't conquer the wilderness, they merged with it. They were the first to understand that in the face of the great cold, your ego is the first thing that will freeze and break off. You have to be fluid. You have to be humble. If the mountain says you don't cross today, you don't cross. You sit, you wait, you chew on a piece of dried meat, and you listen to the wind. Our modern world hates waiting. We see a blizzard as a delay or an inconvenience. To the mountain man, a blizzard was just the mountain having a conversation with itself, and he was simply a guest who knew better than to interrupt. Let's talk about the long silence again. It's something we've almost entirely lost. We have podcasts like this one to fill the quiet. We have music, news, and the constant hum of electricity. But the mountain man lived in a world where the loudest sound might be a tree limb snapping under the weight of snow 3 valleys away. That kind of silence does something to a person's brain. It makes it spacious. When there is no external noise, the internal world expands to fill the gap. This is why their journals, when they kept them, are often so strange and lyrical. They weren't just recording facts, they were recording the vibrations of their own souls against the silence. Consider the case of Joe Meek. He was a man of immense humor and even greater luck. He once famously survived a winter by huddling with a group of trappers who were so hungry they debated which of them looked the most delicious. They eventually found some old, discarded parched corn, and Meek joked about it for the rest of his life. That's the mountain man way. If you can't beat the misery, you might as well laugh at it. It's a dry, sardonic humor, the kind that comes from knowing that the universe doesn't care if you're cold, so you might as well find the absurdity in it. It's the humor of a man who realizes he's been outsmarted by a beaver, but still appreciates the craftsmanship of the dam. And what about the women? We often talk about these men as if they existed in a vacuum of bearded solitude, but many of them were married to Native American women, women from the Nez Perce, Flathead, or Crow tribes. These women were often the true masters of the cold. They were the ones who knew how to process the hides so they stayed supple, how to find the medicinal roots under a foot of snow, and how to keep a lodge warm with a fraction of the wood a white trapper might use.
The mountain man was often a partnership, a blending of European restlessness and indigenous wisdom. Without those women, the history of the American West would be a lot shorter and a lot more populated by frozen corpses. It's another layer of the story that's often left out in the cold, buried under the legend of the lone buckskin-clad hero. As we look back from our climate-controlled vantage point, there's a certain melancholy in the Great Thaw. When the scouts led the wagons over the South Pass, they were essentially opening the door to the destruction of the very thing they loved. They were the architects of their own obsolescence. They guided the farmers who would plow the beaver ponds and the miners who would blast the mountains they named. It's a classic tragic arc. The very skills that made them indispensable, their knowledge of the secret paths and the hidden springs, were the keys they handed over to the people who would eventually fence it all in. But the cold remains. You can't fence in a blizzard. You can't put a thermostat on the north wind. In those moments when the power goes out or the car slides into a ditch on a lonely winter road, the ghost of the mountain man leans in and whispers. He reminds us that beneath our layers of technology and our specialized gear, we are still just warm-blooded animals in a very cold universe. He reminds us to check our fire, to watch our breath, and to remember that fat is fuel. There's a peace in that realization. It's a grounding thought. We aren't as far from the 1820s as we like to think. We still shiver with the same muscles. We still seek the same warmth. The mountain men were just the ones who stayed out in it long enough to stop shivering and start listening. They found the still point of the turning world, right there in the middle of a howling gale. So let's float one last time over the peaks. See the small, lonely plume of smoke rising from a hidden valley. That's Jedediah. That's Bridger. That's 100 nameless men and women who knew the exact texture of a snowflake on a Tuesday in February. They are tucked away, wrapped in their heavy robes, waiting for a spring that they know will come, but in no particular hurry for it to arrive. They've found a way to be at home in the inhospitable. As you finally drift into that deep, heavy sleep, imagine your room is that hidden valley. The blankets are your buffalo robes. The rhythmic sound of your breathing is the wind in the pines. You don't have to fight anything tonight. You don't have to conquer anything. You just have to exist in the warmth you've created. The world outside can be as cold as it wants to be. It can't get in here. The story is ending now. But the mountains are still standing, the ice is still forming, and the fire, well, the fire is always there if you know where to look for the spark. Good night, traveler. Sleep deep, sleep long. The winter is just a season, but the silence is forever.
The long winter of the soul and the final embers. Are you still with me? Or have you already drifted off into that heavy, dreamless sleep of the high country? If you're still listening, just keep your eyes closed. We've reached the final watch of the night. The stars outside are beginning to pale, that pre-dawn silver that makes the snow look like it's glowing from within. We've talked about the survival, the hunger, the madness, and the legacy. Now let's talk about the finality, the quiet, inevitable end of the individual and the era, and what it truly means to be weathered by a life lived entirely in the open. There is a specific word the mountain men used for a man who had spent too many years in the peaks: cached. It was a term borrowed from their caches, those hidden pits where they buried their furs and supplies to keep them safe from thieves and animals. When a trapper was cached, it meant he was done. He had been put into the earth. But it also carried a sense of being stored away, as if the man himself had become a resource the mountain was reclaiming for later.
Think about the physical reality of a man like Bill Williams or Old Solitaire. By the time he reached his final years, his skin wasn't just tanned, it was cured. It had the texture of old, expensive bookbinding. His joints didn't just ache, they creaked like the floorboards of a haunted house. He had been frozen, thawed, soaked, and smoked so many times that he was more mountain than man. He didn't walk, he shuffled in a way that mimicked the shifting of scree. This is the price of the cold. It doesn't just pass through you, it stays in you. It sets up a permanent residence. But there's a dignity in being weathered. In our modern world, we spend billions of dollars trying to hide the passage of time. We want to look fresh and unblemished. To a mountain man, a blemish-free face was the sign of a greenhorn, someone who hadn't yet been tested by the wind. Every scar from a branch, every frost-nipped earlobe, every deep-set wrinkle around the eyes from squinting at the sun on the snow was a badge of rank. It was a map of where they had been and what they had survived. They wore their history on their skin because in the mountains, your reputation wasn't something you talked about. It was something people could see from 50 yards away. Let's consider the rendezvous of the mind one last time. As these men aged and the world became louder and more crowded, they often retreated into their memories. They lived in a perpetual state of looking back. In the dim light of a cabin in Oregon or a porch in Taos, they would replay the greatest hits of their youth, the time the powder was damp and the grizzly was close, the time the buffalo run lasted for 3 days and the earth never stopped shaking, the time they found a valley so beautiful they almost forgot they were there to kill things for money. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with being the last person who remembers a place before it was discovered. They knew the secret names of the creeks. They knew which bend in the river was lucky and which one was cursed. When they died, those names often died with them, replaced by the names of politicians or the wives of railway magnates. The mountain man's final struggle wasn't against the cold, but against the fog of being forgotten. But even in that struggle, they had a unique perspective. They knew that the civilization moving in was just another season. They had seen the rise and fall of beaver populations. They had seen forests burn and regrow. They had seen rivers change course. They had a geological sense of time. To them, a town was just a temporary camp that stayed in one place for a bit too long. They knew that eventually the snow would come back, the fences would rot, and the mountain would reclaim its own. There's a profound, sleepy comfort in that. It's the ultimate don't worry about it philosophy. Why do we still find these men so fascinating? Why are you listening to a monologue about them as you fall asleep? I think it's because they represent the unfiltered human experience. They didn't have any layers between them and reality. No screens, no filters, no middlemen. When they were cold, they were really cold. When they were full, they were really full. Their lives were a series of high-contrast moments. Our lives, in comparison, are often lived in the gray areas, the lukewarm, the sort of, the good enough. The mountain man reminds us that there is a peak and a valley to everything. He reminds us that the shiver is the body's way of saying it's still fighting, and the fire is the soul's way of saying it hasn't given up. He reminds us that even when the world feels like it's closing in, there is always a high pass somewhere, a hidden valley where the air is thin and the silence is absolute. So, let the embers of this story fade out now. The mountain men have all been cached for a long time. Their buckskins have rotted, their rifles have rusted, and their secret paths are now paved over or lost under a century of pine needles. but the wind they listen to is the same wind that rattles your window tonight. The cold they understood is the same cold that lurks just outside your door. You've done the hard work of listening. You've followed the trail through the deep drifts and the long silences. Now it's time to find your own still point. Imagine the weight of a buffalo robe pressing down on you, heavy, warm, and smelling of wood smoke and ancient earth. Imagine the silence of the Rockies at midnight, a silence so deep you can hear the stars. You don't have to be rugged tonight. You don't have to be a survivor. You just have to be a dreamer. Let your mind drift like wood smoke rising up from the valley, over the ridge, and into the dark, cold sky. There's nothing left to do. The traps are set, the fire is banked, and the mountain is at peace. Close your eyes. Let the frost on the glass stay where it is. You are the warmth in the center of the world. You are the spark that didn't go out. Good night, mountain man. Good night, wanderer. The spring is a long way off, and that's perfectly okay. Sleep now. Just sleep.